A US-initiated resolution against Sri Lanka, calling upon the island nation to provide more accountability and establish guilt for war crimes and to implement meaningful recommendations of the Committee on Reconciliation following the war against the Tamil Tigers, has been adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council with a vote of 25 versus 13 against. India has been one of the 25 countries that has voted for the resolution. 13 countries voted against the US-initiated resolution that has created a political storm in India over the last couple of weeks, resulting most notably in the last couple of days with the exit of the DMK from the UPA government. The pictures that you see on your screen right now are from the United Nations Human Rights Council meeting that is still in session in Geneva shortly after, just minutes after the resolution was adopted by the United Nations Human Rights Council. Let's go straight across live to headlines. Today is Lavina Tandon, who joins me from Geneva. She's been sitting in on the proceedings at the UNHRC. Lavina, the resolution it was always expected that it was going to go through pretty comfortably. India has had its say, and now the onus is on Sri Lanka. Tell us how it went.
The only thing was that India was supposed to be possibly moving some recommendations, and that was a buzz. That did not happen. It just had a strongly worded statement, and that's about it. And the real surprise was Japan, who voted for the resolution. Other than that, there were no surprises really. Hello, excuse me.
Lavina, tell us a little bit more about the resolution itself. There has been a lot of talk about it being watered down, and there's been pressure on India to try and intervene to fortify this entire resolution. But none of that really happened. But India has still called for an independent probe. Okay, we've lost that phone line with Lavina. We'll get back to her in just a moment. But just to reiterate for you, the fact that India has voted against Sri Lanka and therefore for this US resolution. This is the second time in the last 2 years that India has voted against its closest neighbor, Sri Lanka, at the United Nations. It's done and dusted. India has called for an independent probe into war crimes by Sri Lanka, and this is likely to send relations with the island nation into turbulence. Remember, over the last few weeks, there has been hectic rounds of consultations between India and Sri Lanka, with Sri Lanka making every effort to either shoot down this resolution or to get India's support as far as voting against it is concerned. We've got Lavina back. Let's go back to her in Geneva. Lavina, tell us a little bit more about the resolution. What does it call upon Sri Lanka to do now?
It just calls upon what it had in the text, except that India added that the investigation should be done to the international satisfaction. That is about it. But the investigation in bottom line has to be done by Sri Lanka, which needs to be independent and credible. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, completely denied any of the, starting from the UNHRC report to what the resolution consists of. They went outright in saying, and very strongly worded, in fact, of the lot, that this is a politically driven resolution and against a country, singling out a country, because this is a country who had sorted out a 30-year-old terrorism problem, and now it has been singling out, and all this happened 3 years back, and this should not be done against them. So basically, this independent investigation has to happen from Sri Lanka while they have already rejected it. So I don't know what progress will be made in next year.
Just take us through what happened as far as the votes were concerned, Lavina. Like I said, it was always expected this was going to be a pretty comfortable passage as far as this particular resolution was concerned. Any surprises as far as the countries are concerned? Pakistan was always expected to vote against.
There was only one surprise, which was Japan, and they voted for the resolution. Other than that, there were no surprises really as from the last year. And India voted for it, but with strongly worded statements to talk about the resolution. That's all that it had. Other than that, there were no surprises.
Gaurav Sawant, our editor, Strategic Affairs, is also with us to give us a perspective on the story. Gaurav, things pretty much going on expected lines as far as India is concerned. There was speculation about whether India would change its mind depending on the text of the resolution that the US had actually put on the table at the UNHRC in Geneva. But at the end of the day, it stuck to its guns, politics riding over national interest, it appears.
Indeed, and it appears that India desperately tried to balance the two. What sources are telling us that India had also tried to take Sri Lanka on board, telling them why they were forced to take this ground, and this was domestic political compulsions that forced them to override, as you rightly pointed out, national interest. But even then, it's the middle path that India adopted, seeking an while they asked for an independent and credible probe, they also wanted broad-based, inclusive reconciliation.
Yes.
And that is what India focused on, that all parties have to be on board. There has to be devolution of power. There needs to be elections in September that Sri Lanka has promised in the northern areas. India wants these high security zones to be reduced, especially from the northern and eastern areas, and people, their lives should come back normal. But at the same time, to keep the domestic audience happy, India is talking about an independent and credible probe into violence and loss of life. India is also talking about the role that India is playing in the rehabilitation of the internally displaced people. So a desperate tightrope walk by India to keep all concerned happy.
Gaurav, what is this likely to do as far as India-Sri Lanka relations are concerned? In the last couple of weeks, we've seen hectic consultations, between high-level officials between India and Sri Lanka. Where are relations headed now? This is the second time in 2 years that India has voted against Lanka.
Look, there is one public posturing and there is a private diplomatic consultation that's taking place. Now, privately, India is telling Sri Lanka, we are on board, we are happy with what you're doing, you just need to do a little more. Reconciliation is what is required, an independent probe is what is required, and India is cooperating with Sri Lanka on regional security in this area. India does not want Sri Lanka to go into China or Pakistan's arms. This is our area. We are the regional power here.
Yeah.
So that is India's primary concern. Public posturing, of course, India is adopting a stand where India wants Sri Lanka to carry out investigations into alleged war crimes, into the internally displaced people, how they can be rehabilitated. So that rehabilitation is India's focus area, and India itself is engaged in rehabilitation of the internally displaced people. So quite a tightrope walk for India. But as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, Sri Lanka also understands the domestic political compulsions in India.
Indeed.
And the Sri Lankan High Commissioner recently was in Odisha. He was felicitated there. There is a lot of interaction that's taking place, not just with the government, also with the opposition. So, there are ties that go far beyond politics of the day, and these are the historical cultural ties between India and Sri Lanka that both countries actually want to build on.
Lavina is still with us. Lavina, the Sri Lankan envoy in Geneva, he said, he threw his hands up. We all saw that when he said, what is this obsession with Sri Lanka? The subtext, of course, was there are so many countries in the world with worse human rights records. And in fact, Sri Lanka has actually gone out on a limb to point this out in the past as well, calling for a question on why this obsession with Sri Lanka. What else did he say, Lavina?
Well, I think his statement was quite strongly worded. Absolutely, he said, "What is the obsession with Sri Lanka?" And another strong statement I felt was directed towards the UNHRC itself, saying the High Commissioner is welcome to visit Sri Lanka to see the progress that has been happening there, and that UNHRC should not indulge in politically driven agendas like this one. Otherwise, it will run into the same fate as the Human Rights Commission. So I thought that was quite strongly worded as well. The 2 points being that this is a politically driven agenda. We do not agree with it. There has been development in Sri Lanka, and if one goes ahead with these resolutions like this, especially Human Rights Council indulges with resolutions like this, they will set a wrong precedent of singling out a country that has actually killed terrorism, and this has been a problem 3 years before, and they are not engaging in the reconciliatory and development processes. So that's exactly what he was saying, and he was very strong in what he said.
Gaurav, there's been a very strong perception that the manner in which India votes this time at the UNHRC is going to send out a pretty strong message, strategically speaking as well. We've seen certain hiccups as far as the strategic relationship is concerned with Sri Lanka. Several meetings that were scheduled were either postponed or deferred. While there is a political side and a strategic side, isn't it, would it be too naive to say that everything is going to be on track with Sri Lanka even after this?
So, of course, it will be, God willing, it will be on track sooner than later. While India wants Sri Lanka to investigate the alleged war crimes, in Sri Lanka in the dying days of the war in 2009, well, the defense secretary level talks were postponed. They haven't been called off, they've just been postponed. Remember, Sri Lankan Airways, they've reduced the number of flights between Colombo and Chennai because the traffic went down. Now, tourism is big between the two countries. Trade is big, expected to be bigger between the two countries. Defense ties, both countries hoping would become bigger. India does not want China to move into this territory, and India desperately trying to retain this territory. Again, for Sri Lanka, India is a very important strategic partner because of the close cultural ties between the two countries. So while there has been the 2009 incident, Mahinda Rajapaksa, the Sri Lankan president, in fact, has gone on record to say that he actually fought India's war in eliminating the LTTE. LTTE killed India's former Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi. So he's saying, without your help, I fought your war and won that war. Why should I be in the doghouse for it? So that is something that Sri Lankan diplomats have constantly been telling India. If India votes against Sri Lanka, which it did, well, that is against the interests of two countries.
Yeah.
But again, domestic political comparisons, we've been speaking to a number of Sri Lankan diplomats, and they said, we understand India's position. It's a tightrope walk. India perhaps did the best it could given the circumstances.
Lavina still with us from Geneva. Lavina, just for the benefit of our viewers, just take us through what happens next. The voting is done. The resolution's been adopted. What happens next as far as procedures are concerned?
Well, at this point in time, what we wait for now is getting reactions from the Sri Lanka and the US and India. What happens now? Hello? Hello?
Lavina, go ahead. We can hear you. Okay, we've lost that phone connection with Lavina Tandon, our correspondent in Geneva. We'll get back to her in just a moment. Gaurav is still with us. Gaurav, the onus is now on Sri Lanka, like it or not, to actually, be seen to be delivering on what has been demanded of it as part of this resolution. An important part of what the Indian envoy Dilip Sinha said in his, the oral part of his speech was that whatever is done now has to be to the satisfaction of the international community. That's a tall order. That's calling for something that Sri Lanka has perhaps never achieved in the last 4 years.
And that is something that India should insist. In fact, the world community should insist on rehabilitation of the people, rehabilitation of the internally displaced, devolution of power, elections in September as has been promised. Now, that is exactly what Dilip Sinha, India's envoy, insisted on. The Lessons Learned and Reconciliation Commission, their recommendations should be implemented in toto and forthwith. That is what is the need of the hour. The independent and credible investigation that India seeks is one step forward. But India is engaged in extensively the relief and rehabilitation projects of the internally displaced people, devolution of power to those people. They should have equal rights, and that is what India and the world community should now insist on the lessons learned and on the reconciliation. That is something that India has been insisting on. But as Dilip Sinha rightly pointed out, it has to be through consensus. There cannot be a third party or a third country interference in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka. You wouldn't want it in India. No other country would want it in their country. So why should Sri Lanka suffer a third party intervention in their internal matters? However, Sri Lanka needs to be constantly counseled and cajoled into giving the internally displaced people, the Sri Lankan Tamils, their rightful due.
Sushant Sareen, Security Affairs Analyst, is with me on the phone line for a perspective on what he thinks about what's happened at the UNHRC in Geneva. Mr. Sareen, how do you think India has performed at the UNHRC today, considering what's been happening over the last couple of weeks and the things that the Indian envoy said today finally?
My own take is that we walked the tightrope without realizing that we'd already fallen off the tightrope. Both domestically as well as internationally, I think we will have mud on our face. I agree with the basic thing which Gaurav is just saying, that we need to cajole and we need to convince the Lankans to do the right thing by Tamils. But I'm sure this resolution is not the way to pressure the Lankan government into providing equal treatment to its own citizens. And I think it's gratuitous advice which is best avoided, especially when the Lankans are a friendly country. We have a lot more at stake with Sri Lanka than simply the Tamil issue. The Tamil issue certainly is very important, but it is not only issue between India and Sri Lanka, and we have important stakes in Sri Lanka. And like I said earlier, I think we've shot ourselves in the foot. This is not going to go down in Sri Lanka, go down well in Sri Lanka, and I think we will regret it.
Sushant Sareen, thanks for speaking the headlines today. V. Krishna Anand, political analyst, to give us a perspective on how this actually plays out, given that the protagonist in this entire affair has, of course, been the DMK, which has exited the UPA just a couple of days ago. Krishna, what are you making of this? The perception is that India has played it safe, despite all that pressure that was brought to bear on it by the DMK just before it ejected from the government. How are you reading this?
Shiv, I think, if foreign policy or, what we do at a UNHRC and all those things are actually taken as some kind of, autonomous strategic positions and all those things, then, this whole business of, playing it safe comes. But at a larger level, I think, India, I've always maintained that, we, one of the founders of Bandung Spirit, that actually foregrounded the whole agenda of human rights in world political discourse, have today actually abdicated. It's one thing for, it's one aspect, whether the DMK was earnest and honest about it and all those things. But as a nation that actually values democracy, and I see, look at the whole trajectory. In the 80s, actually, India took a position. We sent our own army there, which was actually some kind of an interference into another nation's internal affairs. And even if you look a little deeper into it, we walked into a trap that J.R. Jayawardene and Premadasa then actually laid for us, sent our army there, and had blood on our fingers. Much later, when it actually came to take, the time came to take a position on principles that, look, we are not going to allow one people because they belong to they are an ethnic lot, or, because they speak a certain language, we are not going to keep quiet when a set of people are being massacred. It was a genocide that happened. If somebody wants to inquire into what happened in Germany in 1932, we didn't wait for inquiry reports to say that what Hitler did was a genocide. Likewise, what the Sri Lankan government carried out was a genocide against Tamil-speaking people. And we as a nation actually failed in our responsibility to speak about democracy and human rights out there. And now all these things that has happened, the UNHRC resolution, all this tightrope walking and falling off the rope, basically we have fallen between the two stools, is what my perception is.